So Act Two adds to the rising action of the play. As I mentioned, Nora is in under a lot of stress, trying to keep her secret, still maintain the secret of her loan, and she's also again at any moment believes that Krogstad is going to tell her husband what she's done, that she's forged her father's signature, that she's done this crime, that they're now in debt to Krogstad, and basically Krogstad can make them do whatever he wants. Um, so so she's feeling the pressure of this uh, building pressure of this secret and the possibility of it being exposed. She's also, as you'll notice, spending less and less time with the children. Whenever they come into the room, she sort of has to excuse herself, or she just maintains a distance. And this is a big change because in Act One, she was playing with the children. And that's kind of what her role is. She plays a lot with the children and obviously loves and shows them affection and everything like that, but now she's sort of keeping her distance, and it's because Torvald has sort of told her at the ending of Act One that if there's somebody in the house, in particular a mother, who lies, it infects the children with this corrupt energy, and it will corrupt the children too. So he's sort of put this fear in her that she's going to have a negative impact on the children because she's kept lies and secrets in her marriage. And Torvald is sort of using Krogstad as the example that he's a liar, he's a criminal, he wants nothing to do with him, and that he's infecting his home and his children with criminality and bad energy. So he doesn't want Nora to be influenced at all by Krogstad. But Nora's trying her best to try to talk nicely of Krogstad and get her husband to change his mind and not fire him. But it causes tension in their marriage because Torvald hates Krogstad, despite the fact that they have to work together, and he wants to fire him. And Nora's always trying to, but please, Torvald, please keep him at the bank. So she's always begging him and pleading with him to keep Krogstad around. So she's kind of pulled in different directions. She's supposed to do whatever her husband tells her to do, but now she is also being forced to do whatever Krogstad tells her to do because she's under his power with this loan and the knowledge of her forgery. So she's kind of a puppet on a string at this point, being pulled in different directions. And it's causing her, as we'll see, to struggle in terms of her mental health over the whole of Act One or Act Two. But let's take a look at the script here. So Act Two opens, and it's now Christmas Day. You'll notice some symbolic little details. So the Christmas tree is now stripped of its ornaments, and it's burnt down candle ends on its disheveled branches. So it was once beautiful. Now it's looking a really, tattered and disheveled. And that's kind of like Nora herself. She was, once perfect, and now she's sort of showing the wear and tear of her mental health, and it's declining. So things are kind of starting to unravel for her. We see in this beginning of Act Two, Nora's having a conversation with the children's nurse. And we also learn that this is the same nurse that helped raise Nora, because Nora was raised without a mother. So the nurse was really a mother figure for Nora. And they have a conversation. They talk about this fancy dress because it turns out Nora is going to perform at this Christmas party that's going to take place in the evening. And she's going to perform a dance because her husband has asked her to perform this Tarantella dance that they learned in Italy when they went, again, back in the early marriage, when they went to Italy for this vacation. But Nora's going to put on this fancy dress and perform and do her performance because it would please her husband, and she wants to always please her husband. And he picks out the dress, and he's going to help, instruct her while she practices her dancing as well in this act 2. So in reality, Nora says, I would like to tear it into 1,000 pieces, but on the surface, she's going to agree to dance and wear this dress, but, it's the last thing she would actually really want to do. But she does it because her husband tells her to do it. And then she's having this conversation with the nurse, and it does give us a little bit of foreshadowing. She asks the nurse what it might be like to not be around the children as much as they're used to. The nurse says they are so accustomed to having their mama with them. And then Nora says, yes, but nurse, I shall not be able to be so much with them now as I was before. And the nurse says, oh, well, young children easily get accustomed to anything. Nora says, do you think so? Do you think they would forget their mother if she went away altogether? And the nurse says, good heavens, went away altogether. And then Nora asks the nurse, how could you have the heart to put your own children out among strangers? And she tells a little bit of backstory that, she had to give up her own children to work for Nora's parents, or for Nora's father, to be Nora's nurse. And she did it because she got into trouble as a young woman and had to, again, make ends meet. But it does tell us, it gives us a little bit more compassion and empathy for women's place in a patriarchal world where, again, if you were a woman and you get into trouble, like if you got pregnant or if you were not married and you were, you got in trouble, or if your husband left you or your boyfriend left you, again, you could be in a really difficult position. And for the nurse, she had to give up her own children in order to support herself. So she became Nora's nurse or nanny. But she gives Nora some advice. She says, children can get used to anything, even if their mother goes away altogether. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing there that Nora's contemplating what it would be like to leave the children or to not be around anymore. And that gives us a little bit of insight into what Nora's contemplating in the darkest parts of her mind. What happens if she has to disappear from her family. So there is this dark shadow, part of Nora's thinking, her thought process, that worst case scenario, I'm going to have to disappear one way or another in order to make all of this problem go away. So that's, keep that in mind when you're reading Nora's character in Act 2, that she's contemplating the worst and how this whole situation could possibly play out. So yeah, in Act 2, we again get a little bit more information, but it's going to culminate in this dance that Nora is going to perform at the party. Act 2 culminates actually in the practice session where Torvald is instructing Nora in the Tarantella dance. So in Act 2, Nora's going to try everything she can in order to get Torvald to not fire Krogstad. So she, again, puts on her performance of being the perfect wife. And she, plays her part of being the cute little flirtatious Skylark to please Torvald, but he can't be convinced, and he's made his mind up. He wants to fire Krogstad, and there's nothing that Nora can say or do to get him to change his mind. So a couple of things he says to her, I just want to highlight. So she's begging and pleading for him to keep Krogstad, and he says, "Is it to get a or is it to get about now that the new manager has changed his mind at his wife's bidding?" So he's worried that, he's going to look ridiculous before my whole staff if he's swayed by his wife, and it'll make him look like less of a man if they ever discovered that it was his wife who, influenced him one way or the other. So he doesn't want to be unmanly and seem unmanly and lose his authority in the bank amongst his employees. So he can't change his mind now, and he can't make it seem like it was, that he's influenced by his wife at all, because that would seem very, unpatriarchal. And then he also says, Krogstad, his moral failings I might have overlooked, right? So even though Krogstad has a bad reputation, Torvald says, oh, well, maybe I could overlook the fact that he has this criminal past. But the thing I can't overlook is that the way Krogstad talks to him while they're at the office together. So Torvald says, we were once on very intimate terms with one another, but this tactless fellow lays no restraint on himself when other people are present. On the contrary, he thinks it gives him the right to adopt a familiar tone with me, and every minute it is Helmer, old fellow, and that sort of thing. I assure you it is extremely painful for me. He would make my position in the bank intolerable. So what Torvald is kind of saying here is that, he doesn't like Krogstad coming into the office and then talking to him in a very informal, friendly tone. So instead of calling him, Mr. Torvald, he says, hey, Helmer, old fellow, and pats him on the back as if they're old chums and old friends. So he's too intimate in terms of his informal way of approaching him. And Torvald doesn't like that because he wants some power and authority in his role at the bank. And Krogstad's kind of challenging that authority by being too friendly and too chummy, too friendly and informal. And Nora, at this moment, she says, I don't believe you mean that. And she says, because it's so narrow-minded a way of looking at things. And if you watch the video version of this scene, Torvald gets very, very angry, right? Because he says, do you think I'm narrow-minded? And he's very angry when he's saying these lines. So you can imagine that, or I would watch the clip if you have a chance to watch the film version. But he's being questioned by his wife, and his wife has just called him narrow-minded. And that is not what a wife is supposed to do. So she has insulted him by calling him narrow-minded. And then she has also is critical of him in some ways. So she's saying something that she's disagreeing with him about this situation and saying, well, that's so, that's such a minor thing compared to, the consequences of your actions, right? So he gets very upset about that because a wife is supposed to always agree with your husband and never disagree or never criticize him. So she's saying something critical and disagreeing with him, and he gets very, very angry. And he immediately says, well, that settles it. I'm going to send this mail firing Krogstad right this second. And that's what he does. Mails the dismissal letter. So it's been done. Krogstad is now fired. So Krogstad's being dismissed from his job. And Nora really can't do anything about it at this point because the dismissal has been sent. Torvald also portrays himself as courageous and heroic. So he sees that his wife is distressed and upset and worried about what might come in the future. And he says, "Oh, don't be worried. Krogstad can't do anything." He takes her in his arms and says, "Come what will, you may be sure I shall have both courage and strength if they be needed. You will see I am man enough to take everything upon myself." So he's, coming across as a heroic, manly figure who's, gonna save his woman in her time of distress. So if things come to worst case scenario, if Krogstad came and threatened them or something like that, Torvald says, "Well, I'll be man enough. I'll stand up for you. I'll do whatever it needs, whatever it takes to, fight Krogstad or do whatever I need to do." So he's portraying himself as like this heroic figure, and he vows that he'll always protect Nora no matter what. But as we'll see in Act 3, when he does finally find out about Nora's secret and her debt, that's not how he reacts at all. He doesn't come to her rescue. He is going to react in a very selfish, self-centered way, exposing himself as kind of a fraud or hypocrite. So he's saying one thing, but he'll end up doing the opposite of what he's just said to her at that moment. So he's not going to stand up for her. He's not going to protect her. He's not going to take the blame or fall for any of what's to come. So they're both in a way, acting in their manly and womanly roles when they're together. But when push comes to shove, or when they're in this rough, desperate situations, they both act out of opposite or differently from their gender roles. We've seen how Nora, in her desperation at times, took on little odd jobs, man's work. She's had to hide those jobs from her husband. So she's tried to, pay back the debt by taking on little jobs here and there, whenever she could get an extra time to do it. And she talks about, last Christmas she had hidden her work from Torvald, and he had no idea that she was doing work behind closed doors. He thought she was making a bunch of decorations for the Christmas tree, but really she was doing like copy work, and getting paid for that under, in secret. So they are both kind of trying to live up to gender expectations. But it turns out, those expectations are kind of a fantasy, an ideal that no one can live up to, and also kind of false, right? So that's part of what's going on in their interactions with one another. We also get a little bit more insight into Nora's relationship with Dr. Rank in Act 2. Dr. Rank, as we'll learn, is a wealthy person, a bachelor, but he's also gravely ill. So he's kind of suffering from illness that he's been born with, that he inherited from his genetics, from his father. And there's this motif also of the passing down of illness and corruption and disease through one's parents and passed down to the children. But it turns out Dr. Rank and Nora have a kind of emotionally intimate relationship. It's not physically intimate. It doesn't become an affair. But she's in a way closer to Dr. Rank than she is with Torvald, because she tells Dr. Rank the truth about what she's doing and or sort of tells him the truth, and confesses things to him that she doesn't confess to her husband. Dr. Rank doesn't learn about the secret and the loan, though, so he doesn't really know anything about that, but she does sort of treat him more as a friend and confidant than her husband. So there's some question of emotionally, and is there an emotional affair with Dr. Rankin? So we learn some information about Dr. Rank. Like I said, he has grave illness that is going to lead to his death imminently. And he suffers from a consumption of the spine, which again is believed to be a genetic inheritance from his father, who was kind of a degenerate character. He drank too much, he slept around, he had, bad diet. So all this bad behavior of his father has somehow passed down to him and has caused him to have this genetic inheritance of illness, and it's going to cut his life short. So Dr. Rank is kind of a character, minor character, side character, but he plays a role in the sense that he provides a contrast in the relationship that Nora has with her husband. He presents an alternate relationship for Nora. It turns out that Rank is not just Torvald's best friend, but he's also Nora's best friend. And she talks more intimately with him than she does with her own husband. And in Act 2, he will eventually confess his love for Nora. He sees that Nora's distressed about something, and he says basically, I would do anything for you, Nora. Just ask, and I would do anything for you. I love you, basically, is what he tells her. He says, your husband is not the only one who loves you that way and would do anything for you. So at the moment that he says this, Nora cuts off any of her intention to possibly ask Rank for help. She could have at any moment, asked him for the money to pay back Krogstad, to pay back the loan, or to pay him off completely. So she could have asked him for any kind of favor in terms of wealth, and Rank would have done it for her. But as soon as he confesses his love for Nora, she can't ask him anymore, because she sees that would be drawing a line or crossing a line morally. And in her marriage with Torvald, it would cross the line to borrow money from a man who clearly was in love with her. So she sees that she's not willing to cross that line, and she doesn't actually tell Rank what's going on with Krogstad or the debt or the loan or anything like that. So she stops herself from asking for any help from him. And then his role kind of dwindles in Act 3. He announces to Nora his imminent death by giving her a card with a cross on it, a black cross, and that signifies that he is going to lock himself up in a room and basically not interact with them anymore, because he knows Torvald has an aversion to anything sick or dirty or deathly. He doesn't like any negativity in his life, so he wants to so Rank has said, I'm going to just lock myself up in a room and die and pass away, basically. So he's saying, I won't be around this time next year, I'll be invisible. So he's imminently expecting to die in the next year. And so Nora is going to lose her friend Rank too imminently, and she knows that. But she's also lost him at that moment that he confesses his love to her as well, because she knows at that moment, even though she might have always known, at some part of her might have always known that Rank had a kind of crush on her, or that their connection was always maybe a little bit, more than friends. They never crossed that line. They never said outright that there was love there or affection or attraction. But as soon as he confesses his love to Nora, she has to put an end to that relationship, because that would compromise her marriage to Torvald. Even if it was just an emotional relationship that they've had, it becomes, morally corrupt if she has an affair, an emotional affair outside of her marriage. So she puts an end to that relationship. And then at the very end of Act 2, we get Nora's dance. And this scene in the film version, I would again recommend you watch the film version. But it gives a sense of Nora's, or sort of symbolic sense of Nora's mental decline, her unsettling, disturbed mentality. And it connects to how she feels oppressed in this situation and also in her marriage and in society, which is all, again, patriarchal society and her husband's control over her marriage and everything. So it tells us a little bit about her mental state, but when she's dancing, she kind of loses control of her movements. And despite her husband telling her exactly how to do the dance and how to keep, order and control, she kind of just loses control and her hair comes undone and she sort of starts twirling wildly. So it does give us this sense that, things are unraveling for Nora. She's no longer in control of the situation. She's lost control, and her life is about to sort of rapidly unwind and fall apart. The symbolism of the tarantella. So the dance she's performing is called the tarantella, and it's a folk dance that originated in Italy, and it was believed, at least in folklore, that the dance was a symptom that was displayed by women who were bitten by this tarantula spider. And the poison would infect them and it would cause them to release that poison through this manic style of dancing or frenzied style of dancing. So that was kind of the folklore around this dance. But it became just a fun way for villages and towns to release a little bit of pent-up energy. When they lived in a very oppressive culture, they would have festivals where everybody would kind of do the tarantella dance, and it would be a little way of excusing some, or like releasing some pent-up tension when you live under such a rigid, controlled environment. And that's a little bit like Nora. It does relate to her situation where Torvald has been so controlling in her marriage that, she has found little ways to sort of release that tension. And the dance is one of the ways that she sort of breaks free out of his control and is kind of experiencing a form of a release of some of that tension that she's lived under. So that's kind of the culmination of Act 2. It ends with Nora practicing this dance that she'll perform at this costume party in the evening. And the fact that it's a costume party is also going to be relevant and symbolic because, in a way, that Nora has always been a performer. She's always put on an act. She's had to perform for Torvald her whole marriage and pretend that she's a perfect person and always do what she's told. She's always had to hide things in her life from him in order to be that perfect wife for him and what he expects of her. So she's going to put on this other performance, this costume, and it's going to be just another costume or performance in a life that's already been performative. So it's kind of a layered performance at this point. So that's basically Act 2.